Okay, folks, hope everybody enjoyed lunch. We're going to get underway here in just a second with a great panel on responsive design. Before we do that, just a couple housekeeping notes. Reminder for those of you who weren't here first thing this morning that there was a change in the Wi-Fi password, which is reflected up here, but on the handouts that you received with the schedule, the password was listed as Winter 2014, which thankfully we are no longer in.
Feels like it, though.
At least it seems like it might be spring out there today. You never know from one day to the next. But it's spring 2014 with a capital S in case anyone is having issues with those. With that, I am going to kick things over to George White, who's going to be moderating this session. And we've got a good slate of sessions lined up for this afternoon, so I hope everyone enjoys. And George, take it away.
Hi. Hey, everybody. My name is George White, as Dave said. I'm the SVP of Innovation at Cantina. We're actually just right down the street. We're going to talk a little about responsive design. We're going to talk mostly about performance and why that matters in responsive design and how we overcome that. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hey, name is Brian Kalma. Run a pretty new UX coaching and strategy shop called GetGlorious. Been at it just for 5 months, but background is mostly e-commerce UX stuff from Zappos, Guild Group, and Jimbara.
Hi, everyone. Sirota. I'm a principal architect at Blue Train. It's a SaaS multi-tenant content management system that focuses on some of the issues that we're going to discuss later today.
Hey, my name is Weil. I'm the VP of Products for a company called Yottaa, also right down the street. We are a SaaS solution that specializes in optimizing the performance of websites to maximize engagement for users.
Cool. So I have a really quick poll for the audience. How many of you here for your websites are actually using responsive right now? Pretty good number, actually. It's awesome. How, for most of you, how long has it been like in the last year, last 2 years? Let's start with the last year. Who's done the responsive from last year? Last 2 years? Cool. And then longer, I'll assume, or maybe even shorter. So I guess one of the questions that I'd like to start off with is, well, I guess actually let's back up and just say, I'm assuming, given that so many of you actually have done responsive, that you guys kind of know what we're talking about with responsive web design. Just for some basic context, about 4 years ago, Ethan Marcotte wrote an article called Responsive Web Design that appeared in a list apart. It's actually will be 4 years ago next month. And in that, he kind of laid out some principles for handling user experience problems across multiple device contexts. So he was basically talking about the idea that we, for years, had been designing sites around the constraints of the desktop. And basically, that wasn't really getting it done as we started to see new device types appear. So really this was triggered by the fact that we had these great mobile devices that had browsers that actually mattered. Before 2007, before the iPhone and before Android, we really didn't care about mobile from the browser perspective that much. We kind of did, but there were all sorts of weird technologies we had to get into, and a lot of companies didn't make an investment in that. But Ethan basically laid out this principle of responsive web design and said there's 3 things you should do to do this, to get these sort of great design system experiences that will allow you to deal with these devices. You should use fluid grids, basically allow your pages to sort of shift and move. You should use flexible images, which basically is the idea that your imagery should actually work well on all those devices. And you should use media queries to basically determine how to actually have the system respond. And that was great. It kicked off a whole bunch of discussion, and everybody thought this was an awesome idea in the design community. And we all kind of started to go into this. And at first, it seemed like it was going to be really simple. It was just those 3 basic ideas, those 3 basic techniques. And what's happened in the last 4 years is that our notion of what responsive is and how we actually do it has expanded greatly. And one of the things that's happened, one of the early sort of rubs against this was a lot of people rushed into responsive and then found that performance was terrible. And they couldn't quite understand why. They couldn't quite understand, well, hey, I did all this stuff. I made all this stuff work. And they thought all about the visual design stuff, but they didn't really think about all the other things that were going to happen with it. And what I'd like to talk about today with the panel is basically why that is, how we can resolve it, and what we should be thinking about in the future to deal with that. So I guess starting off, and maybe I'll start with Ari on this. What was the sort of the core problem with performance and responsive? Why did we see this happen, where so many sites were not performing well even after they had done this?
So I think it comes down to how you look at responsive web design. When people talk about the big R versus the little r with responsive, the little r being everything is a client-based problem that you just have to solve. It's about presenting information in a way that can collapse down into a mobile presentation with a very small viewport that's very long, sort of, and tall, versus the very wide and maybe somewhat shorter experience that you get on a widescreen desktop display. The issue with that is that the challenge that you have with mobile, and that includes tablets as well, although less so because people are typically connected via a Wi-Fi connection where the connectivity and the throughput will be better. But if you look at mobile, you're actually trying to take an enormous amount of data and shove it into a device that has a smaller viewport, it has a shakier network connection, it has a slower processor, and sure, those things are getting better all the time, but the reality is the tools that the developers were using to develop the solution and the device that you're consuming it on were not really designed for one another. And we're shoehorning a desktop solution into a mobile presentation in a mobile context, and that simply doesn't work. And I think a lot of the developments around getting to a capital R responsive design is doing dynamic server-side delivery of the objects. Now, there's a million challenges with that, and I'm sure we'll get into quite a few of those today. But being a product guy and a product guy for years and dealing with different enterprises who are trying to also maintain a corporate identity but then develop products that everybody can consume, the realities are you need people who can implement those things, and you need a scalable way to maintain them over their life cycle. And those two things are not as easy as some of the people writing about some of the forward-thinking changes in responsive web design, for example, are really marrying. There's the reality of the thing that you're trying to solve, and then there's the theory behind how you can solve it.
I think that's exactly right. Kit, in terms of some of the stuff that I was just talking about thinking about big R responsive and how do you actually deal with that? So, Blue Train, you guys are working on content management as a key part of this. How do you see it sort of, as I was saying, sort of extending it down from sort of the front end further down, and what do you need to do there to sort of address the problems that we're seeing?
Right. Well, the problem is several-fold. The first is obviously when you're implementing the website, you're considering the cost of the implementation and the performance that you're expecting to see. And that initial performance is oftentimes not correlated to the performance after the website is launched. And this is partly because of, for instance, in content authoring, typically a content author might not compress their image to the lowest resolution or may not offer several different sizes for a responsive website to serve up. As a result, what you end up having is a super, super optimized website at the beginning because all of the developers and the designers have taken quite a bit of time in ensuring that the website loads as quickly as possible. But then as soon as the website is rolling out and getting new content, we're seeing a significant slowdown. And as a part of that, there are things like media management in terms of do we serve up the right sized image for this device, whether it be on 3G connection, 4G connection, Wi-Fi, or whether it has a retina display, and we may want to actually sacrifice the speed but still ensure the quality of the image. So there are a couple of things on the image side that certainly help quite a bit. Additionally, we're working with minifying assets, serving assets off CDNs, and as much as possible trying to reduce the number of requests coming to the browser.
Gotcha. So I guess looking at that from a slightly different perspective, Brian, obviously Kit just talked a lot about the tooling and what you need to do there, but there's also the user experience and the design considerations you have to make up front to really handle this. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, totally. So like most of the companies that we work with now at GetGlorious are like seed stage businesses. Some of them haven't even launched. They're really early on. So, many of the founders or people within these companies tend to automatically make an executive decision that we're going to create a responsive website. And they say that right out of the gates without even understanding the core fundamental things that I think are necessary in making decisions like that, such as what sort of content is important across different devices, right? So, user experiences are all designed around content that needs to be presented to a user at a certain specific time. So, from my vantage point, I tend to think that responsive, as cool as it is, as many problems as it solves, as hot as it is right now, is not my de facto solution when I talk to these startups. I first make these, or encourage I shouldn't say make, I don't make anyone do anything, clearly, not even myself. But I take most of these folks through an exercise to help them prioritize not only the content, but what the purpose of the experience is from device to device. We constantly talk about screens from a responsive perspective, and we all like to take the corner of the browser and make it smaller and say, look, it's responsive. The reality is consumers aren't doing that. Consumers are accessing that kind of thin, narrow screen on their device, which with it comes its own constraints. You're not always on a Wi-Fi connection. Sometimes you're on 3G, so you have to worry about the size of your images and things of that nature. You have to also determine if the mindset someone is in while they're holding a mobile device is quite different than when they're sitting at their desk. So you're going to present content in a very different sort of way. And I think making sure that people understand that responsive doesn't necessarily solve the problem of how you prioritize your content. It simply gives you a mechanism to put it all into one code base, and that isn't necessarily the right solution always. That's the genesis of the way we work with our clients.
So you actually raised a great point, which is that, although, I mean, we tend to come, at least at Cantina, the idea that it is sort of, from an implementation standpoint, it's going to be your default, right? We're probably going to arrive there with all those considerations.
Probably, I would agree there.
but first off, I mean, we're talking about performance in the context of responsive and why that matters, right? So, maybe can we talk a little bit about, back up a little bit and talk about sort of why you care about that in the first place? Well, I mean, what's the difference here? I mean, we can assume that outside of responsive, people should care about performance. Why do we care particularly in the case of mobile? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are the effects?
Of performance?
Yeah, I mean, we know there's studies like Google, for instance, or Amazon has looked at this and said, look, there's a real cost to this. How do you sort of keep that in mind as you're going forward and making these choices?
That's probably, could I pass that one over?
You certainly can.
Right. Well, part of that includes, and unfortunately, the reality is the budget that's available, right? So at the end of the day, it's a cost performance formula that has to be evaluated. The millisecond response time cutoff that Amazon has that you referenced, that's something on their scale that make a difference, but also with the investment that they're able to make in maintaining that content and maintaining that infrastructure. As opposed to a smaller website, a seed startup or something like that, where the reality is you need the reach and the ability to market to anyone that visits your website. But at the same time, there are certain limitations that are cost-based and that ultimately will result in the decision-making process that you probably make with your clients.
Yeah.
So maybe actually, could we talk about the idea of how you set that benchmark, right? I mean, you raised a great point, Kit, which is, okay, for Amazon, 100 milliseconds makes a huge difference. It may not make a huge difference for a seed startup, or it may not make a huge difference for someone who's in an established business. But so how do you start to set those benchmarks? How do you say what's enough performance to get by? Like, what are we looking at here?
And I think I would even back it up a little bit and say, how do you define optimization? When you optimize your website, what are you optimizing for? We're sitting up here talking about responsive web design and performance, and that's really important. But again, what is performance? Is it a measure of speed? Is it a measure of the number of transactions or the conversion rate on your website? What are you actually looking to optimize? And what is the experience that you're looking to give your user? I mean, Brian touched on something really important as well. When you're thinking about optimizing your website, when you're thinking about modernizing your website, when you're thinking about launching a new website, what are you really trying to achieve at the end of the day? Yes, you want a new website. We got that. Let's put that off to the side. Now, what do you want it to do and why? I think there are two recent studies that actually were brought up around when people were talking about mobile first. Mobile first is sort of a way to force you into the discussion about responsive web design, I think. It's a really effective one. And then you can say, my m.site is a strategy. No, it's not. It's a tactic.
Right.
And actually, responsive is my strategy, but that's just like cost-cutting and efficiency at a corporate level. It's something that we aspire to do. Maybe we're not going to get there right away. So when we look at how you actually evaluate what you're trying to do and prioritize what you're developing, Fathead actually did a great study on their website. And they actually looked at, with a responsive design, how is it being presented to users in what context, and how is that monetized for them? So when they had 4 columns, what was the click-through rate? What were they making? When they had 3, 2, and 1. And then from there, they took it to, we're not touching on this, and that's not the point of this panel, but I'm going to say it anyway, because that's what I do. Do you go native, or do you do HTML5? And for them, once they actually went through, and most companies they can't afford to do this. They don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the resources, they don't have the time, they don't have the budget, but they actually did quantify exactly what their HTML5 website was doing for them, what they were trying to do with their consumers, and realized that they had a very real need for a local solution or a native solution on mobile phones because they needed things that responsive and HTML5 just weren't providing it.
Yep.
And I think one of the things that maybe Kip could talk to better than any of us up here is when you start looking at things like what Fathead looked at, do I use HTML, for example, or do I use a native app? Well, you have to think about, too, a lot of people with responsive design are saying make it HTML5 compatible because, hey, that's where we are right now. It's 2014. Well, how many of your users are still using IE8? And how many of your clients or customers are in enterprises where corporate standards dictate you can't rely on HTML5? Now what do you do?
Right.
I think that's a great point. Actually, a couple of things you said there. One of which was the idea about infrastructure, right? Like that a lot of this is, okay, when we talk about that front end and a very simple design idea of, use these 3 front end techniques and it's great, but the infrastructural implications. And I think you touched on something that's really important, which is the idea that yeah, when we talk about the front ends, we can separate those from the larger concerns of the business. And an app may be the answer, an app plus the web may be the answer. There may be any number of ways you want to do it, but you need to concentrate on those underlying elements first, right? And you need to build those up. I think the other thing too is you kind of touched on this too about the corporate mandate around what standards you can use, right? I mean, responsive sort of makes certain assumptions about the capabilities that you're going to have, right? Media queries sort of require you to have a modern browser. They stop working at some point. Sure. So how do you handle that? I mean, how do you sort of maintain the idea of I'm going to be responsive, I'm going to have these things, but somebody in there's going to make a decision, and how do you keep that system performant from a speed perspective, from a business management perspective, from a goals perspective?
Oh, is that on me?
Yeah, that's all you, Kate. You got to answer that one.
I have a bit of a bias. Up front, I probably would not go with the native route unless the native app was built in HTML5. And the reason that I say this is if the consideration is that you need this application or this content available without an internet connection, you can do that with an HTML5 app and preload that content. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, you can also now reuse that content across different devices. You can even potentially make it available in the browser just as well. This enables you the performance advantages, but doesn't tie you down to managing several different versions of an Android app to support the different APIs, several different versions of an iOS app, and so on and so forth. Touching also on the infrastructure part, if you were to go down the native app path because you're delivering content that maybe has more media or things of that nature that just do not behave well in mobile browsers today, the infrastructure for delivering that content to your app also needs to be able to deliver that content to your website, right? So there's a common API point that is hit for content. That needs to be a big consideration of building out the website in the first place, which further adds sort of to the cost and the complexity of operating and maintaining this.
So I want to touch on something that I think I heard implied there, which is legacy. Right, the notion that, I mean, I think if we were to look at, if you look at a specific example where someone says, well, the site, I made it responsive and it still doesn't perform well, it's largely probably due to legacy, one kind of other process, people, platform, right? Can we talk a little bit about that, maybe from each of your perspectives, maybe start with you, Brian?
Yeah, totally. I'm going to kind of piggyback off of something you said a little bit and sort of slightly disagree a little bit and say like, and that is like, I think it's, when I think about designing when I think about designing experiences for customers, I'm always thinking about what's best for the customer. I'm almost always discounting out of the gates, at least during the design process, performance and all the things that the business is going to care about. And, because I come from the vantage point of, if it's good for the user and it satisfies, the objectives, let's go forth and do it. And sometimes responsive would be good for that, sometimes it wouldn't. So in the case where let's say you have an experience that requires users to take photos. I'm just arbitrarily saying that. You're almost forcing a certain decision to go to consider native much stronger than you are from responsive, just from the function that provides. Right. So that to me seems to be should be at the forefront of every discussion around responsive. Is like, why are we doing it, and what does it mean to the user? So that is, to me, is the filter, and that's the thing that I'm constantly thinking about here. And I'm a huge fan of responsive, don't get me wrong, but I'm also I also realize that there's so many other solutions out there that can satisfy what your users needs, not what your business needs.
So you touched on something that's interesting there, Brian, in that the idea that maybe sometimes the core problem is making a wrong fit for the problem. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
Maybe you shouldn't have done responsive; it just was not the right answer.
Perhaps,
because of any number of reasons. Either it doesn't fit the user experience you require, it doesn't fit your technology or capabilities, whatever.
As a designer, if I heard myself say what I'm about to say, I'd probably slap myself. So feel free when I do this. But
Kit, you're up.
It's like. Working with some of the businesses that I'm working with, early seed stage businesses, they have very little money. They have, even less time, and they need to get something out the door. And they're often kind of going page by page in the design process of creating a responsive site. And I actually sometimes advocate for that because in the scenario, like what I'm about to say, you send an email out to your user base and they click on it, there's a high probability they're clicking on it on their mobile device. But if your average order value is $1,000, there's a probability they're not buying it on their mobile device. So maybe certain pages, depending on the inbound marketing, are what need to be optimized depending on your budget, right? And also depending on the user need, because you're giving the user a better experience by giving them a better landing experience, even if the rest of it isn't solid.
Right. I think that gets to something, going back to the legacy question as well, around the idea that, okay, so I have an existing website, and I've got to move that whole site. How do I make that decision? How do I move individual pieces maybe to start doing that? And then how do I do that in such a way that when I do it, I know that the effect and the plus is going to be that it's going to work well, not just from the perspective of speed, but also from the perspective of actually accomplishing the goal. So maybe we can kind of shift a little bit away from the user experience part of it, but talk a little bit more about how do I move those platforms? How do I move people forward? You know, maybe Kit or Ari.
You want to kick this off?
Sure. The one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't say, so I mean, listening to what you two guys said, and I'll make this exceedingly brief since we do want to move it on, but if you look at an example that came out of LinkedIn, LinkedIn in 2012 were out there, you know, beating the drum of responsive and HTML5. They are the way that you build applications. And then users went out and started using the new LinkedIn app, which was an HTML5 app. It was not a native app. And what they found was it worked perfectly, except that people used it a lot. And then all of a sudden it started crashing browsers on mobile phones. And you know how much you actually get feedback on a mobile device when something like that happens. You have no idea what happened. I mean, I am one of those angry people in the airport going, where am I going to, why isn't it working? And that's what you have people doing. It wasn't a problem that they anticipated. And so when you're coming from legacy into the modern world, I think one of the things that you have to realize is, first of all, when you think about the challenges that you're going to face, and you mentioned something very briefly, Kip, about, you know, you wouldn't necessarily advocate for native. They had to go native because they had to do memory management, but they didn't know that at first, and it wasn't one of the core drivers of their whole modernization effort. Now, are there ways that they probably could have made sure the browsers didn't crash? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they didn't get there. So instead, they decided to go native. Now, what that taught LinkedIn, and what I think is a good lesson for everybody in any sort of a context, ourselves included being a service provider for companies who are building these websites, is you have to rethink testing. Even just something as rudimentary as, you know, Brian's talking about what you want to design and what kind of a budget you have and how you're going to start integrating that into your website. Well, how are you going to test it? That is one of the fundamental steps. And when you have a responsive design, one of the things that you realize is fixed widths don't work anymore. Content areas are variable and change. How wide is my device? Well, I don't know. What day of the week is it, and what product announcements were there yesterday? Like, do we have a new screen size? You can use a Wurfel database to tell you a lot of things, but it's not going to tell you connection speed for the individual user that's connecting to your system. So how do you deal with that? That's not part of the usual test matrix. So I think, for me, when we try to pull people into a more modern way of thinking of developing websites, one of the things that we talk to them about beyond their goals is, what's the skill set on your team? What is your tolerance for external consultants? How realistic is it for you to use an external consultant when you realize, you know, to use something from history, you think about a dynastic cycle, right? When there's a dynasty and then it wanes, and then there's a dynasty and it wanes. Well, that's how your website works. You launch a website, the performance is fantastic, and then marketing, don't change the images. Don't create any campaigns. IT's got this, right? And then you go out there and you say, I need to engage with users. 86% of marketers in 2014 are looking at social media as the primary means of engagement with their customers. Talk to an IT group and ask them what they think about all the different social media avenues. It's not going onto Facebook and chatting. It's what does JavaScript and third-party componentry do to your website performance, scalability, and security. We just came out of the whole OpenSSL heartbleed, and as a result, people have a new reason to revisit what's going on their website. So I think as part of this whole modernization effort, it's realizing that fundamentally, your website is an app. It is not a series of pages that just have to collapse onto different viewports. It's a distributed application that's very complex, and increasingly, because of the economies of scale, you're also required not necessarily to just use people like Brian who are external, but you've got to use third-party services for every single click. How do you mitigate those things while you're also trying to give the user the context and maintain the performance?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up the third-party stuff because I was going to. So no, I think that's a great point, which is how much control do you actually have, right? I mean, there's a point where your app that you're building ends and somebody else's services come into play, right? So that's both can be core, so like the stuff that you guys are doing, or it can be an auxiliary piece that's sitting outside of it, you know, your ad network or your analytics or any number of components that may be in it that may be causing problems for you. How do you manage that complexity? I mean, how do you basically sit down and say, especially if your viewport on this, you know, prior to say 2007 was, well, websites are right on my web pages, right? And things have changed. I mean, the complexity curve for developing for the web has steadily gone up since 1995. It's never decreased, and there's no sign that it ever will decrease. And the tools are getting better for handling specific problems, but not getting better for handling the total problem. So how do we handle that?
Well, I mean, it's at this point, the industry, or rather the standards for responsive are still in many ways hackish approaches or things that or clever approaches, whatever the case may be, they're not standards yet. Like the picture tag, for instance, empowering the browser to make the right decision based on what it knows to be the connection speed and the resolution and the DPI and so on and so forth. Those standards are not quite there yet. So the way we've sort of approached this problem is give the developer all the flexibility that the developer will need to be able to build the most optimized site for the use case that he or she is working on. And then beyond that, when the website is actually in production and in sort of day-to-day authoring mode, if you will, how do we help the marketers to ensure that the workflows that they use are also going to, that there are significant helpers in place, if you will, to make sure that if you do add some additional JavaScript or throw a bunch of images on a page, that those are intelligently resized and actually compressed rather than, so it's a twofold problem. We see that there is definitely technical challenges which have not yet been solved very well, and then there's also the challenges for the marketers who still want the fast website that they paid for just now, but also want to be able to author it.
So, I think I already mentioned IT. I mean, how do they fit into that? Because again, I mean, it's, okay, great, they've got to keep the thing going. So is it that we should remove them as much as possible and go with a SaaS? Is it that we should find some ways to sort of help them? And what's the out for them?
Well, I probably have the most biased answer to that.
All right, yeah.
But as far as SaaS is concerned, it does take the IT component out of the equation. It effectively gives the control over the website to the marketer and the agency that they're working with, right? So in terms of hosting, security, patches, updates, all those things are really no longer sort of in the IT domain, in the SaaS world, if you will. But in, to that degree, we still would love sort of the input from IT, but it's always been difficult, and it's always been the pain point that marketers have expressed. That any sort of updates to a blog or whatever else through IT is many week-long process and doesn't get the results they're looking for.
Right. So Brian, I mean, your perspective today with GetGlorious is a little bit different because you guys are working with seed companies, and so they're building from the ground up.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you see that being different from? I mean, they don't have an IT group that they're fighting against. So what are the chief concerns for them in trying to figure this complexity out?
Yeah, I think what I've realized, at least in these 5 short months, is that a lot of these seed stage businesses are really interested in speed to market.
Yeah.
And that it may sound like a no-brainer. So you find them making these big decisions out of the gates in the interest of getting to market really fast, and that seems to be that seems to trump everything else up until a certain point. And I'm not sure when that point is, and it varies per company, but what I've already started seeing is that some companies that are maybe 5-6 months old who whipped out some sort of responsive site, or in the opposite case haven't, are almost universally 100% in a situation where they're considering a re-architecture because they didn't think about certain foundational things. So one of the things I'm trying to coach these folks on is that speed to market is a component, but not having to keep re-architecting is a secondary component. I'm reminded of a time, it was 2007. It wasn't, clearly we weren't in the responsive world yet, but we had painted ourselves in such a big corner at Zappos. And I don't know if you guys remember what the 2007 website looked like at Zappos. It looked like Craigslist with a bunch of colors. Right. And but it's not like we, as a designer, I wouldn't look at this thing and be happy and pat myself on the back and say, look at this thing. It was hideous. But we got ourselves so caught up in purely optimizing our site for speed and getting stuff out the door as fast as quickly as we can, and we were prioritizing the increasing conversion today, as opposed to thinking about how improving the web experience, making it more scalable, extensible, could improve conversion and lower costs down the road. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where we have to pause for about a year to re-architect this whole thing. Right. And that after going through that, and even going through that a little bit at Jamvara, I'm at a point now where I would say pause and slow down a little bit and make sure you are considering not only your performance metrics, which you need to define before you start talking about performance, but also understanding your content needs and your user needs, because those to me is the amalgamation of these decision points.
And I think part of the challenge there is the reason that your company exists, my company exists, and a lot of the other SaaS solutions and even CMSs out there are fighting basically for control over a market. If you look at the tools that you're able to apply for those companies and the decisions that you're forcing them to make based on the tools available to actually execute on those decisions, then looking at the content management systems, why is it when a marketer wants to upload an image that it's not automatically providing them with multiple versions of an optimized copy of that image that'll be delivered to the user correctly based on their device? Instead, what the marketer is thinking about is, I've got this ping. I know that it's not going to look pixelated when it goes up on the website. It's what I got from Marcom. I'm putting that into the CMS. It's probably going to take care of it for me because, come on, it's 2014. Like, we've been talking about this for a long time, right? Well, we have been talking about it for a long time. But when you think about content management systems, look at one of the more forward-thinking ones, Drupal. Drupal is an open source phenomenon, right? And I've worked for a startup before this one where, you know, we shared a founding company, and so we were really intimately connected with one another, where they had the commercial arm of Acquia. Well, what does the content management provider Acquia have to think about? It's not how do we make Drupal the most impressive content management system in the world. It's how do we operate at scale with tens of thousands of customers that all have different needs, that all have their own customer bases, that are all going to have their own peaky times on the website. It's not going to be by dynamically serving all the right content to all the right people all the time. It's going to be, how do we make everything the same? And how do we make everything pretty repeatable so that if there's a crash, I can fix it. I can roll it back to something that I know is predictably going to be consistent. Or if we need to start growing the platform, how are we going to meet the needs of everybody that's running on the platform at the same time? That is an entirely different set of challenges than the individual company is going to be facing. The individual company has a little bit more leverage to work with somebody like Brian, provided that the tools actually exist. And then you look at the problem with responsive web design and how people are making mistakes, and you realize that, you know, people love making excuses, right? But in this case, it really isn't their fault. What were they expected to use? So when you talk about dynamic serving, who works for your company? I mean, every single one of you can take stock of the company that you work at. Think about your IT department. Think about your last round of hiring. Now, there will be exceptions to this rule, but you're probably not looking for the most experienced, the most, you know, detail-oriented, and the most expensive person that you can find. You're probably looking at almost exactly the opposite of those things, and then trying to hire in volume. So how do you expect those people to be following thought leaders like Ilya Grigorik at Google, who is doing phenomenal things for the internet? But implementing his designs and his ideas is going to take another 5 years. And so you may have to re-architect a few times over the course of the next 5 years, which is to be expected. So I think it's the responsibility of vendors like ourselves, and at Yottaa we're trying to help people through this. And I don't want to sound altruistic because we're not the only company that's doing that. But we try to make sure that we give you that insulation so that as the technology grows, we can keep you on the forefront of what you can do to deliver an experience to your customers without you having to have the resources available to you that Amazon has. One last point, and then I promise I'll shut up. But if you think about Amazon, people go to an Amazon website, and just by show of hands, who thinks that every time you go to an Amazon page, it loads in 8 seconds or less? Okay, so you know it's a loaded question. In some cases, it can take over 20 seconds to load an Amazon page, but nobody would ever know that. They have the resources available to them to load the page progressively so that you don't notice it. Facebook 7 years ago was very obvious. You'd see little islands of data popping up all over the screen, and people were like, wow, that's really cool. How do they do that? Nowadays, you look at that site and you'd go, well, that's a crappy website. Look how slowly it's coming up, and it's not fluid, and it's not together. It's the same thing as when a site progressively renders from the top down. You think, I am not giving them my credit card, right? But if you think about now where we are today, what they can actually do is something that most of you are going to have a lot of difficulty achieving in your organizations. It's something that Yottaa enables. For example, if you have a page, so I think about my mobile device, right? And so this is one of the gigantic screen phones, arguably, but this phone on your website probably takes 4 scrolls to get to the bottom. If you have trust icons on your website, where do you put them? You put them in the footer. A lot of times those are going to be connected to a third party via JavaScript because it's going to validate all the time that your site is still secure. What are the odds that I am going to scroll 4 times to see that on my mobile device? In which case, why would you send me that image every time I go to a page? In which case, if you have it on the footer of every page, why would you serve it to me 20 times if I view 20 pages? If I never once look at it? You've given me 20 opportunities to have your website lock up and me to get mad at you. And we know that when a consumer leaves a website, 29% of me will wait a year to come back to you. 29% of me will never come back if I find another website that seems to do the same thing. I'll forget you existed until you give me another reason to come back. So now you're off spending money on marketing that you wouldn't have had to have spent if you could have done a better job of sending content to my device.
So I think that's awesome. I think it's something you said there about re-architecture, which I kind of want either Brian or Kit to kind of give me a little thought on this. But it sounds like one of the key things then is again, it's those KPIs, those metrics that you want to have. And because you're going to have, that's the only thing that's going to be consistent going forward, right? Which is what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What matters to your audience? So, I mean, how do we think about that in the longer term? And it sounds like, we have to encode that first, but what's the best way to sort of capture that?
To capture like what matters?
Yeah, what matters, exactly.
Yeah.
And how do you maintain that over that longer 4 or 5 or 10-year period? And rather than just the sort of the reverse of that would be, you're looking at your A/B testing, you're constantly looking at making change.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'll come at it from a user's perspective. Sorry to keep talking about it that way, but like, from my vantage point, I rarely will touch any sort of design work without at least having some conversations with some users. And it sounds, I'm not trying to say like, you need to be doing usability studies all the time. That's not my point. My point is, have some conversations with the users, like ask them those simple questions, literally, what matters to you? It sounds so trivial and simple, but most of the companies, at least that I've interacted with, don't even do that out of the gates. It is simple. It takes hours. And you start formulating a matrix of user needs that you can help you define how your mobile experience needs to be, and then to help inform your decision on doing responsive or not. That isn't a direct answer to the re-architecture component of it all, but it is like a starting point to help you determine what to build and if you need to re-architect. It's, again, coming at it from the user's perspective, talk to them. It's that simple. There's so many tools out there you can use if you are afraid to step outside and talk to someone.
Gotcha. So we're getting close on time, so I actually want to ask one last question, then maybe I have one or two audience questions. In terms of who's doing it right? Who's doing it right? I mean, who may be doing it really, really badly, in your experience? I mean, if you can talk about that.
In one way, the more siloed you are in terms of a single installation, let's say you have a WordPress, Electron, or Drupal, or any of these things, in a siloed environment, you are not getting the advantages of the latest and greatest technologies as they're coming up, right? So on the SaaS platform like Yottaa, you are always on the cutting edge, and you're never necessarily working with IT or whatever else to make sure that you have the infrastructure for this or whatever else. So at that point, in terms of over time progressively enhancing and getting the most out of your infrastructure, SaaS seems to be sort of the solution today. In terms of re-architecting, this is something that, going back to the agency days, the first question is, what are you looking for, right? Is there a return on investment is there a benchmark, or is there data that you already have against the website that you have operating, and which metrics would you like to improve? So to that sense, re-architecting may be a little strong, but iterating every 6 months or so on the data that you have for the last 6 months is something that could greatly impact the performance of the website.
Totally. Well, I'll add one quick thing I would say, just popped in my head, is like, ever since that Zappos experience I had with crazy re-architecture, I've always taken with me the notion of like a life cycle for the actual website that exists for any company I've been at, and like a horizon where you deliberately plan to sunset it or do something with it at a certain date and time. A little thing like that helps, I think, an organization at least rally around the temporariness of an experience without getting upset that it's not working to plan. About who's doing it well, I love how Skinny Ties does their experience mobilely. Just throwing it out there.
Awesome. So any questions in the audience? Anyone?
Sorry.
We have one?
We have been talking like, okay, we are at the beginning when we went like mobile pages, mobile response pages, this is nothing that we started with very low. Now it's going higher and higher, good experience. Do you think that if somebody in the previous sessions has said it's a good thing where we were and where we are, and we will be in a good position? But according to the budget, and don't you think we spend a lot of money, or is it worth that much money spent, or how does it go when it comes to budget?
So I think, the question is, how do you reconcile budget with what you're trying to do with your mobile experience? And I think if you're a company like, and I'll just reference the Fathead example again, just because, again, if you guys ever do look that up, it's a phenomenal example of how you can do a good job of assessing your need to spend some money. They were able to make payback very, very quickly for the amount of money they spent when they realized that the linchpin to them selling more stickers for a wall was being able to use the device camera to actually show the user through the viewport, that's what that sticker is going to look like on that wall. So whatever your version of that ROI assessment needs to be is what you need to perform. And I will say that one of the things that people have to keep in mind is cheap can be very expensive.
Yeah.
So just when you're trying to shoehorn something in to get it done quickly and inexpensively, just consider how much lost opportunity it is, not how you're converting on the leads that you get, but what are you actually leaving, what people are bouncing from your website because you took that shortcut.
Maybe one more question? Oh, I don't know. Do we have time for that?
I guess, gosh, I could just repeat on my answers here.
Yeah.
I guess I would say if you really truly understand and have a point of view on what your mobile purpose is, determine then if responsive can satisfy it or not to help aid your decision. I don't think it's as binary as MDOT or not. I think it's truly starting there. And if if responsive can satisfy what you want it to be, I'd actually be a huge advocate for it. If it can't, pause and probably evaluate all your options.
And the only exception that I would make to that is if you already have existing large implementation that there's no way to tear it out and replace it, MDOT is a great supplemental solution to ensure that at least you get capture that audience.
And the one thing I would piggyback off of that is just if there's one assumption that you do jettison while you're considering keeping your MDOT site or moving over to a responsive design, don't filter content for your users. There's nothing worse than when you create an MDOT site to do it with the idea in mind that you're going to be curating content to show them less. It's a mistake when people do it in responsive to only show certain columns, for example, and it's a mistake when you do an MDOT site. You're just frustrating your users.
Right. One other thing about MDOT on that is you really do want to have a concept of smart redirection. So when somebody hits your website from a Google link to, let's say, About Us, and it automatically redirects you to the MDOT version, it'll likely take you to the homepage and not the content that you searched for. So that relationship between the MDOT URLs and the desktop site URLs has to be really, really tightly integrated for a good experience.
Okay, I think with that, we're out of time. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.